For the last 7 years, movies based off DC Comics have been hitting theaters. Some of them are awesome, and some of them are awful. Well, today I'm starting a 3-part series ranking all 45 theatrically released DC movies. Today we're starting off with the 15 worst DC films. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your picks for the worst movies based off of DC Comics. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, as a reminder, remember this is part 1 of a 3-part series where I'm going to rank all 45 theatrically released DC films. In a couple of days, you'll get my ranking of the middle 45 films based off DC Comics, and then at the end of this week, I'll share my picks for the 15 best movies based off DC Comics. With that said, let's get started. In last place, Justice League 2017. Now, when this movie first came out, I appreciated finally getting to see the Justice League all together on the big screen. But at the same time, it felt like a movie that had been directed by committee, processed to death, and filled with some of the most obvious reshoots I had ever seen. But over the last 4 years, and with the release of Zack Snyder's Justice League, it's become incredibly clear that this movie was a cynical attempt to turn Zack Snyder's movie into something completely different. And the grossest part about the whole thing is that they used the death of his daughter as an opportunity to pervert his vision into something completely different.
Not impressed.
Joss Whedon's style and skill set is absolutely not compatible with Zack Snyder's, but from there, they mandated to him that he take this 3+ hour movie and squeeze it into a runtime under 2 hours while adding in a bunch of stupid jokes. This is a bit like reading the Cliff Notes version of a great story, except every page has been written by a different person and it has a bunch of really bad jokes thrown into the mix. When I look at this movie, I simply see an abomination and some of the worst examples of how Hollywood can go horribly wrong, so it comes in last place. Number 44, Jonah X, one of the most shockingly bad films for a major studio to have put out within the last 15 years. But it's not so bad that it loops back around and becomes good. It's not so bad that it's funny and amusing. It's so bad, it's boring.
That's awful. Just awful.
The plot is both overly simplistic and largely incomprehensible. There's not a whole lot going on here. The runtime with credits is only 81 minutes, but absolutely nothing is explained. When it comes to both the flow of the entire story as well as individual scenes, everything feels chopped to pieces like we're watching a heavily abridged version of a larger story. It's also a movie that was clearly written to be rated R. It's from the writers of Crank, and then they converted it into a PG-13 movie. So it has all these scenes that set up sex, violence, torture, profanity, and then right as you're about to get to the sex, violence, torture, and profanity, it cuts away. So every time something awesome's about to happen, you don't get to see it. This is a big studio picture with a bunch of A-listers. There is simply no excuse for how choppy and sloppy this movie turned out, and it's not even worth checking out to see how bad it is. Next up, Supergirl. Now I gotta say, the score for this movie, it's actually really good. Helen Slater, not bad casting. Everything else about this movie is a painful, charmless, incoherent train wreck. Supergirl flies down to Earth in order to find an object with her city needs in order to survive. It's life or death stuff. As soon as she gets to Earth, she flies around for 15 minutes, then she sees humans playing sports and decides to enroll in college and join the sports team, in which then it turns into Revenge of the Nerds for about 15 minutes of screen time. There's no explanation given as to why suddenly her education trumps saving the people of her city.
You serious?
As dumb as all that sounds, it's even dumber with the execution, and the dialogue is even worse.
Without it, this city can't survive more than a few days.
Our lights will grow dim and the very air we breathe so thin.
It's a movie so bad that they cast legendary actor Peter O'Toole only to have him walking around the Phantom Zone saying squirt.
Squirt. Squirt.
I have a ton of nostalgia for these films, but I find this movie tedious to sit through as an adult. Number 42, Steel, the first of several movies on this list where they decided to convert a DC character closely tied to an A-list hero, only to never mention the A-list hero and rewrite the backstory to exclude the actual property that we care about. Now, this is a movie that I've avoided watching for over 20 years ago. I watched it for the very first time about 6 weeks ago, and it was just as bad as its reputation. To state the obvious, Shaq is not a great thespian, or a good thespian, or even a halfway decent one. He's a 7-foot-tall plank of wood that exudes zero charisma in this movie.
This guy's really good.
Really, the whole thing is cartoonishly goofy. For the most part, it's just so bad it's boring, but it does have moments of so bad it's good, especially as you move into the finale and you see Annabelle Gish's character spinning around in a wheelchair shooting lasers at people, then Steel defeats the villain with reverse psychology. The costumes are pretty hilarious, but in general, this is a movie. It's harmless. It's not offensive. Then we have Superman and the Mole Men. I feel a little bit bad having to include this movie in the bottom 15. This was the very first movie theatrically released based off of a DC property. It actually turns 70 this November, so it's an important piece of history for the comic book movie genre. But at only 58 minutes and being produced on a shoestring budget such a long time ago, it feels like it barely qualifies as a movie. Plays a lot more like a 1950s creature feature than it does a Superman story. It takes place 2,500 miles away from Metropolis, involves these creatures from the ground showing up in this town, invading them with toxic waste and a mob forming to try and take the creatures out. There's not very much action, and when it does take place, it's very minor, and unfortunately, it's simply not a movie that's aged well because of the constraints under which it was created such a long time ago. So while it might be an important piece of history for the comic book movie genre, that doesn't make it good. Kicking off the top 20, The Kitchen. The movie seems to think that it's Scarface with women, but it's really not. The problem is none of these women feel like real humans with consistent personalities or motivations. One day, they're passive housewives. The next, they decide to be mob enforcers. And it just happens. No transition, no setbacks. They just very quickly turn into these people that are offering protection and collecting money from people. The movie just feels like it's rushing through plot points. All of that would make for a dull and bad movie, which it is, but technically speaking, this is a more proficiently made film with more coherent storytelling than a lot of the other films here in the bottom 15. What really pushes this movie so far down on the list is its entirely ill-conceived central concept. The movie tries to tell this story about these three housewives turning into sociopaths as a tale of female empowerment.
Not a great plan.
Multiple times in the movie, it attempts to justify the horrific actions of these women because of sexism. If you want to tell a tale about housewives turning into violent criminals, that can be interesting, though this isn't. But if you want to try and explain how murder is a valid expression of female liberation, we have a problem. Moving along, we have The Return of Swamp Thing. 7 years after horror legend Wes Craven's original Swamp Thing, it got a sequel, only this time it plays with the tone of a screwball comedy, minus all of the jokes. It's just goofiness for goofiness' sake. The main plot involves Heather Locklear investigating her evil stepfather and his evil experiments, which means that Swamp Thing is kind of a secondary character in his own movie. No one in the film acts like an actual human. They don't have proper responses. Like when Heather Locklear first meets Swamp Thing, she doesn't seem at all surprised to have a walking and talking plant right in front of her.
You're a plant, aren't you?
Oh yeah, and the movie features a PG-13 fantasy sex scene between Heather Locklear and Swampy. That last sentence might sound random and out of nowhere until you realize this movie was directed by Jim Wynorski, who prior to this worked on several Roger Corman films. After this, spent the 90s directing a bunch of erotic thrillers, and then for the last 20 years, he's directed such porn parody classics as The Blair Witch Project and Para-Knockers Activity. So you know you're probably in for something classy with this one. Number 38, Catwoman. Of all the obvious paths to take a Catwoman movie, how do you choose this? Do you want a complex character associated with Batman, a cat burglar but with a decent heart, constantly torn between good and bad? Nah. Why not throw out all Catwoman lore and instead tell the story of an artist killed by an evil makeup company, but brought back to life by an Egyptian cat in order to battle the evil makeup saleswoman who's gained superpowers by using too much makeup? What?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Oh yeah, not only did Catwoman become a superhero because of the Egyptian cat, she also got some sick skills on the basketball court. This is a shockingly bad idea for a movie, executed just as bad. The hand-to-hand fight sequences are filled with CGI rather than stunt work. The entire plot is held together by a bunch of coincidences. Now, to be fair, this one does have a good bit of so bad it's good potential. It is energetically bad. It misses the mark by so much, it hits a different target. Comedy. Next up, Batman and Robin. Whereas many of the films in the bottom 15 are here because of production troubles or budget issues, with Batman and Robin, I think they made the movie they set out to make. Unfortunately, no one else wanted to see that film. After going camp with Batman Forever, Joel Schumacher decided to crank the camp sliders up to 11 with this film and go full-blown live-action cartoon. From the terrible bat jokes,
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
To the unforgivable versions of characters, to its attempt to be the punniest movie of all time.
I want us to be together, but I want to make sure you're serious about turning over a new leaf.
Hey, freeze.
The heat is on.
Let's kick some ice.
Everything in this movie is either a total miscalculation or poorly executed. It's even tough to know who this movie was designed for because it's way too goofy for adults.
Louder, come on, sing!
But it has way too many butt, boob, nipple, and crotch shots to think it was designed for children. By this point in time, it's been long acknowledged that this movie was made to sell toys.
First movie, things felt much sharper. The second one, I felt like I was making a toy commercial.
The merchandising and licensing became a very, very important part of the making of the film, and I went along with it.
And the end result is one of the biggest blockbuster misfires of all time. But for me, an entertaining, very bad film.
Didn't you apologize to the crowd at Comic-Con for Batman and Robin?
I always apologize for Batman.
If I disappointed them in any way, then I really want to apologize, because it wasn't my intention. My intention was just to entertain them.
Coming in at number 36, Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. After Superman 3, Canon bought the rights to the Superman franchise, and they wanted to return to the vibe of the first two films. Unfortunately, they didn't have the money to pull it off, so they had to cut corners everywhere to try and make this film, and nowhere is this more apparent than the fact that they reused the same shot of Superman flying all throughout the entire film. Beyond that, the plotting is absolutely horrendous. For the first 15 minutes of the film, things are just happening that are supposed to happen in a Superman movie, but none of it actually ties into the main plot of the film, and it's tough to know if this is due to the script, the production, or the movie being killed in the editing room. It's well known that as much as 45 minutes of this film, or a third of its runtime, were cut during the editing process. And this means a bunch of events happen in the movie that aren't set up. We just see them take place. Other times we see reactions to events that weren't shown at all. The sad part is that this was Reeves' last time playing the part, and he really wanted to make this a good film.
We're playing out the fantasy of what if there really were this person who could show up and end one of the greatest problems of our time, which is the nuclear race. And if we get it right, which I think we're doing, this will be the best of the Superman movies. And that's not just a pep talk, I think it really will be.
And unfortunately, they simply weren't able to execute at the heights of his ambitions. I find this to be a very watchable, bad movie. It's not good, but I can get enjoyment out of it. Then we have Superman 3, a film that works better as an 80s comedy than it does as a Superman film. Whether you're talking about the fact that they decided to focus the film on Richard Pryor, or that it opens with this slapstick sequence with a Mr. Magoo type character, very clearly the producers and the director did not understand the Superman character and weren't very interested in telling a Superman story. Beyond that, it's a movie that it spends the entire first half of the film going on rabbit trails and setting everything up, so the main plot line doesn't kick in until about 60% of the way through the film. That's where you get the evil Superman and where they build the evil computer. As just a movie, this is a better made film than Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, but as a Superman story, Superman 4 clearly understood the character better than the people that made Superman 3. Christopher Reees very publicly criticized the way this movie turned out.
I had not been really thrilled with the way Superman 3 worked out. And don't need to say anything more, except sometimes things work, sometimes they don't.
And he made Superman 4 as an attempt to try and set things right. Unfortunately, that didn't play out very well. Number 34, Suicide Squad, another victim of how poorly run the WB was in the early stages of the DCEU. It's well known that they announced the release date for Suicide Squad before they had a finished script. This meant that director-screenwriter David Ayer only had 6 weeks to write the shooting script for the movie. Then in early 2016, when Deadpool got rave reviews and Batman v Superman got very lukewarm reviews, the WB got cold feet about Ayer's darker tone and wanted it to be funnier like Deadpool, so they commissioned a whole bunch of reshoots. They brought in the people that had cut a more fun trailer and reworked his entire film, both re-editing it, removing much of the score that he had for the film and replacing it with pop songs, and putting out this Frankenstein's monster that was one part David Ayer, one part trailer company, and a whole bunch of executives micromanaging. To the movie's credit, the cast and characterizations are quite good. There's a bunch of chemistry amongst the squad, but the story and storytelling are just a total mess. And it's tough to even know who do you blame when there's only 6 weeks to write the script and then the movie was entirely reworked in post-production. The one person you know who screwed this up were the executives who didn't take the time to do it right. There is some positives in here. It did make me want another Suicide Squad movie, but unfortunately the film we got is kind of a mess. Real Real quick before I give you my final 3 picks for my bottom 15 DC movies, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your picks for the worst DC movies. Also, remember there's 2 more parts in this series coming this next week. Be sure to come back to check those out. Also, I previously ranked all 58 Marvel movies. You can check that out right up here when this video is over. Moving along to Red 2, and this is probably the least interesting and most forgettable film in the bottom 15. It's a mixed bag of a little bit of fun, a bunch of stale jokes, and some good enough action. I enjoyed the first Red enough, but I never even bothered to watch Red 2 until I was prepping this video, and then I watched it and I went, okay, that was essentially exactly what I was expecting. The first Red was a fun but forgettable film, and the second one is a slightly less fun and even more forgettable film. The plot is way too convoluted. There's way too many things taking place, so there's no possible way to make sense of why any one person is doing any one thing at any given moment, besides the fact that the plot requires it in order to get to the next action sequence or joke set up. But these movies exist for the sole purpose of showing this batch of actors having a bunch of fun on screen together, and I suppose it's good enough at doing that. It's not a movie that I would actively decide for no particular reason to rewatch. If I'm in the mood for a movie like this, there's a whole bunch of other movies I would pick before I'd go with this one, but if I had to watch it again, I wouldn't mind either. It's just kind of there. Coming in at number 32, Green Lantern, a dull and forgettable superhero movie, but one that I don't think is nearly as bad as its reputation. It's more disappointing than disaster for me. Now, the movie takes way too long to get going. It's 40 minutes before we get to Orr. It's over an hour before the very first Green Lantern superhero action sequence, and the movie in general has very little Green Lantern action. And once we get to the third act climax, he's battling a cloud? And there's no way around this. The CGI costume looks terrible. Oops! Seemed like they picked a villain that was too big for the story they wanted to tell. The first 2 acts of the movie make it clear that Parallax poses this existential threat to the Lantern Corps, and he's just wiping out top lanterns left and right, and then this brand new Lantern is able to defeat him all by himself. Like, it just doesn't add up quite right. It's a real shame because Martin Campbell is a great director. I actually think Ryan Reynolds is good in the movie, and he has great on-screen chemistry with Blake Lively. And apparently they had great chemistry behind the scenes too, because they got married and brought multiple children into the world. Apparently there was a lot of trouble behind the scenes, both in trying to get the script together, and then Campbell and Reynolds didn't see eye to eye on things, and I think you see that on screen. But to be clear, I don't think this movie is the total disaster that some people make it out to be. It's just a big letdown. Oh yeah, and Taika Waititi's in it. Closing out the bottom 15 is Wonder Woman 1984. Now, when I first saw this movie in the theater, I think I saw it with a little bit of rosy-colored glasses because, hey, it was the end of 2020, and I was just excited to see a big blockbuster comic book movie on the big screen. But even when I first watched it, a bunch of things with it didn't quite sit right with me. On the positive side, it's a movie that has fun taking advantage of its 80s time frame without overly relying on pop culture, but the movie keeps swinging for the fences and it strikes out way more than it knocks it out of the park. But in order to pull together all of these big plot threads into a single story, it has to compromise its logic, consistency, and continuity far too often. There's just so many little details that skirt credibility. Like, I know I'm watching a movie about an Amazonian goddess with a magic lasso, but you have to have some rules that govern your universe. There has to be some logic for how things work. Otherwise, you're constantly pulling me out of the movie as I'm going like, hey, wait a minute. How did that work? And that's the frustration. In order to achieve its lofty ambitions, it came at the cost of a consistent set of rules and logic, and that just cheapens the payoff of the film. It does have some great moments, but I can't overlook its faults simply because I respect its ambitions. Be sure to come back later this week to see how I rank the remaining 30 theatrically released DC films. Or if you're watching in the future, you can just check out the other parts right over there. Also remember, I did rank all 58 theatrically released Marvel movies. You can check that out right over there right now. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.